Thanks so much for coming back, or coming if you weren't here before. So just to slightly reprise a little more fully, last week I told a story about how and why American psychiatry in the 1980s pivoted rapidly towards biology, so rapidly that actually people in this period spoke about a revolution, a biological revolution of the 1980s. And the revolution, the so-called revolution, consisted of a more or less wholesale rejection of previously dominant psychoanalytic, social science perspectives that had dominated the field since the Second World War. The most important point I wanted to leave you with last week was that in spite of what the general public tended to believe, this rapid pivot, this so-called revolution, did not happen because there had been any fundamental scientific breakthroughs. It happened because the socially activist Freudians had overreached, because the field was on the brink of losing all authority in the eyes of its own practitioners and sense of many members of the public. And in a sense, people fled to the brain. And in the course, therefore, of establishing this new orthodoxy that was going to now privilege medicine over social activism, biology over therapy and psychology, it makes sense then when I tell you that these biological revolutionaries made their case primarily on first principles. It was, of course, psychiatry is a medical discipline. Of course there's such a thing as real mental disorders, and of course they're going to have a biology. And when they pointed to science, and they did sometimes point to science, but the science that they always pointed to was partial, provisional, and in many cases more than a generation old. And everybody who on the inside, who was an honest broker, knew that. But what they hoped was that now that they were in the driver's seat, the gap would actually start to close between rhetoric and reality, and then breakthroughs would finally now come. So today I want to tell you the story of what actually then happened. And let's start here with the so-called 1990s decade of the brain. A lot of you are old enough to have lived through it. A few of you, maybe not quite. But I start here because this is where people initially invested so many of their hopes for realizing the revolution. There would be an influx of federal funds that would allow concentrated work in the brain sciences, would jumpstart the real revolution, particularly because of excitement over emerging new brain imaging technologies. The potential of using these brain imaging technologies to identify markers of specific mental disorders that then in fullness of time would not only lead to better diagnostics, but new kinds of treatments. Now, there's a longer history between this idea that you can use imaging technologies to find out something about mental disorders. Some of you may know about the work that started actually in the 1970s from the Scottish neuroscientist Eve Johnstone. She used the technology called CT scans, computerized axial tomography. This takes a static image of the brain. It takes a picture of the anatomy of the living brain. And what she found was some evidence that the ventricles, or the cavities in the brains of schizophrenics, were larger than those in age-matched controls that she used. Over the next several years, other people would confirm this finding. Some people would even use siblings. In a few cases, even an identical twin study, all of which seemed to show that people with schizophrenia have bigger ventricles than people who don't have schizophrenia. But what did it mean? How did it help? By the mid-1980s, even Johnstone was clear that, would admit it wasn't quite clear where you go with it. But now, in the 1990s, there's new imaging technologies There's positron emission technology, PET technology. There's functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And these are able to do more than simply take static pictures take anatomic pictures of a static anatomical brain. They allow researchers to create colorful images of the brain's blood flow, the brain's metabolic activity. In that sense, they can create pictures of the brain in action. And this sparked the hope that psychiatrists or clinicians in due course will be able to look at the brain activity of their patients when they come into the clinic and immediately see what's wrong. Now, who lived through this period? Yeah, I mean, this isn't like meant to be, but who remembers this period? I remember this period. And what do you remember about it? We were going to have the tremendous. I remember I was at Harvard, and they were trying to get an initiative going called the Mind-Brain Behavior Initiative, and it was, you remember, Ken, and a lot of it was about we need to get one of these imaging machines in, these new fMRI imaging machines, because that's how we're going to get all the breakthroughs. Now, I think there were some significant new insights for fields like cognitive neuroscience that come out of the brain imaging. I'll be interested what Mike thinks about the impact of brain imaging on cognitive neuroscience. But the breakthroughs in the area of mental health didn't happen. And this was partly because conclusions about what a depressed brain looked like as opposed to a not depressed brain varied across studies, proved really hard to replicate. But it was also, again, because in the end, it wasn't quite clear what the practical, on-the-ground implications of all this cool research was going to be for the care of mentally ill patients. And this is Tom Insel looking back in 2010 at the decade of the brain and basically saying, I spent a lot of money. I gave out a huge number of grants. I didn't move the needle. In terms of the things that in the end we should be caring about, recovery, greater recovery from mental illness. What about genetics? Well, in the late 1980s, it looked like psychiatry was about to score a major success on this front. I don't know if any of you remember a period around 1987 when claims began to be made that researchers had discovered the gene responsible for making a person susceptible to bipolar disorder. Do you remember that? Or knew about that? Do you know the origins of this? It lies in a story that is so romantic, it could be the basis of a novel. It started in the 1960s when a then sociology graduate student named Janice Egeland got permission to move in with a family from the Old Order Amish community. She was a sociology student and she had wanted to live with them because she wanted to do a study of their health beliefs, write her PhD about their health beliefs. They let her move in. While living with them, one day she became aware of a woman in the family just racked over, weeping, in incredible emotional pain, and didn't know what to make of it. And at a picnic, she tells the story over and over again, at a picnic, the grandmother explained, this runs in our family. Sis im Blut. This is the old Amish German. Sis im Blut, it's in the blood. And for whatever reason, this remark just rocked Egeland, and she decided, forget about the health beliefs, I need to understand. I'm going to commit myself to getting to the bottom of what kinds of scientific truths might lie behind the grandmother's insights. Now, this revelation might have stunned Egeland. She was a sociology graduate student in a way that was nothing particularly groundbreaking in the suggestion that manic depression might run in families. There had already been some family studies that had pointed that way, but Egeland found when she began to explore funding and collaboration that everyone got really excited. Why? Hmm? It's a closed, what the Amish live in a closed genetic community, so they don't marry outside of their clans. Yes?
There are two other things too, which is that the Amish are very open to medical science, and they keep
Very good records.
very copious records in their family Bibles, which they opened up to her.
You know this study, that's exactly.
And the other thing is there's a very low rate of substance abuse.
Well, you're pulling all the bits out, but this is all true. No, it's okay. So there are a lot of things. It was that they don't smoke, they don't drink or take drugs, so there will be less of a possibility of masking or interaction between the side effects of substance abuse and manic depression. They keep very good records. They don't marry outside of their clan, and also they live according to because of the belief that they've opted out of modern life. They live the same kind of lifestyle of simplicity and humility that they would have lived 150 years earlier or before. So any kind of variation in behaviors you could track across time, it was believed, could be attributed to biology rather than to cultural upheavals. So they become this amazing human laboratory, as she puts it, for behavioral and medical genetic studies. And then things get even more exciting. The Amish study researchers decide to do something that had never been tried before. They have these new technologies from molecular biology at their disposal. They've identified a clan within the Amish community where there seemed to be a quite large concentration of cases of manic depression. And they got the members of this clan to donate DNA samples in order to do something called a linkage study. In a linkage study, you look for the presence of a segment of DNA with a known physical location on the chromosome, the marker. And if you then find that individuals who suffer from a particular disorder that you think is genetic, you think is inherited, if you find that they have this marker, but people without the disorder don't have this marker, then there's a high probability that the unknown gene for the disorder that you're interested in is being inherited along with the marker, that it's linked. And what they find is that nearly 80% of the people who had manic depression within this clan also had a particular genetic marker near the tip of the 11th chromosome that the healthy people from the clan didn't have. And nothing like this had ever been found for any disorder, psychiatric or otherwise. So look at this. For the first time, the application of a generalized strategy for scanning the human genome has provided convincing evidence, blah, 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 for the localization of a gene. These findings have broad implications for research in human genetics and psychiatry. Psychiatry is all of a sudden being a path breaker for medicine as a whole. It was a really big deal. Look at some of the newspaper coverage. Amish study shows mental illness isn't all in the mind. Research on the Amish gives insight into manic depression. Amish help isolate depression gene. Janice Eaglin goes onto TV and says this.
What it means is that we have shown the first definite proof that there is a gene predisposing to this condition, which says it is a medical condition, that there's a biological basis for it. This should give hope to people who have felt that somehow it's the way they've lived or it's a lack of willpower that they have a problem. If we can have removed some of the social stigma and embarrassment so people come forward for treatment, there are effective treatments. What it means...
The problem was it all turned out to be wrong. Within a year, 2 people from this original clan who did not have the marker began to develop symptoms of manic depression. And then when the researchers went to look for a similar linkage patterns in members of another Amish clan, not the original ones they'd studied, they didn't find the link. And so 2 years later, the first paper is 1987. She goes on TV. 1989, they retracted. They'd failed to confirm. And the disappointment in the field, palpable. in that period. And long-lasting. There was an interview that was carried out by this man, with this man, David Dunner. This was in 2001. You can see what he's saying here. You know, I know we were naive to think that there was just going to be a gene. Now we're trying to look at interactions with around multiple genes. But it'll be nice to know when people ask, is this a genetic disorder, that to be able to do more than just say, well, we think so. But well, we think so is more or less still where the field is today. Yes?
I don't know if you want to take a comment now.
Yeah, sure.
Well, you know, I think you're being a little hard on this.
Okay.
You know, it turned out not to be a single gene. The linkage analyses were falling apart in all kinds of fields, not just psychiatry.
Okay.
And people were having, eating crow.
So I'm not saying that other people aren't having embarrassing experiences either.
The statisticians were coming to these people saying, you know, our techniques are, there's too much slip and slide, we can tell you. The other thing is, you know, so it's not the tip of chromosome 11. There are 5 loci now, and it's all come from the Amish study.
All right. So the Amish study was.
And there's a protective loci that's found in dwarves that where none of them have bipolar disorder. So I think it's a little harsh on the study.
I take that on. I'll take that on board. Nevertheless, David Dunner is still pretty sad. In 2001, and it's you know, and the work remained. There was a thing, we've got one now in in the can, and we didn't. So what about then developments in drugs, in drug development? We are so used to assuming that the pharmaceutical industry must have been or was central to driving the biological turn in psychiatry, so they must have been important. They were important, they are important, but their role in this story is a bit different than I think is widely understood or supposed to be. And to understand how, you need to remember at least 2 things. The first is that the pharmaceutical industry is an industry. Its primary responsibilities is to sell drugs, hopefully good, useful drugs, but it needs to make its stockholders happy. And it needs to post good profits. Second, even though you sometimes hear that the industry cynically promoted biological approaches to mental illness in order to just promote its drugs, the truth is more complicated because, in fact, they had been successfully selling drugs for psychiatric conditions all throughout the so-called Freudian era. No trouble selling drugs when the Freudians were in charge, using ads like this one from the mid-1970s. Can everyone see this? No. Not really well. Let me read you a few things. First of all, this is for a drug, a benzodiazepine called Valium. Here's the patient, him. And here's all the women who cause him psychic tension. Here's his mother-in-law, his mom. Now, she's not even his mother, she's his mom. And there's a longer sort of history behind the momism, as it's called. Mom, the wife, the daughter. Poor little son is way out here in the corner. Friend, male friend. So all the men are there, all in shadows, far away. He doesn't understand the source of his psychic tension, says the ad, but you do. Who's you? What kind of psychiatrist? Yeah, the Freudian, but the prescriber, but who will be who's doing therapy with this guy. He relates well to women with domineering traits, but not to men, not even to his own son. And then they go on to say that when psychic tension is a significant component in the presenting symptomology, Valium can help in order to kind of break down resistance and get and encourage a better outcome with in therapy. For your passive-dependent, tension-ridden patient dominated by women, and for countless other psychoneurotics, Valium may prove itself a helpful partner for your psychotherapeutic skills. Yes? This is 1977, I think. Pretty late. And Valium, Valium was no minor sort of product out there. The benzodiazepines, particularly Valium, became by the late 1970s the best-selling prescription drug in medicine. Not the best-selling psychiatric prescription drug. The best-selling prescription drug in medicine. In 1978, 2.3 billion pills were sold. So they didn't need biology to make big money. But given this, how do you explain the fact that by the early 1990s, you begin to hear people say that drugs had slain Freud. Drugs are the reason that we no longer believe all that psychoanalytic gobbledygook and instead have reverted back to a medical understanding. How Prozac slew Freud. In the past 100 years, psychiatry has come full circle. Psychoanalysis lost, medicine won. Prozac seems to have something to do with this. So let me tell you a little bit about a one-time, very, very famous antidepressant called Prozac. Who's never heard of Prozac? That speaks for itself. Everyone. But if you are old enough to remember the early years of Prozac, you remember maybe that it was widely touted as a wholly new kind of antidepressant, that it was a designer drug, that it was a drug based on new biochemical research that had come out of the biological revolution. I want to tell you in the first instance that none of these common assumptions about Prozac are actually true. That Prozac actually was a variant on a class of antidepressants that have been around since the 1950s, the so-called tricyclic antidepressants. I talked about these drugs a little bit last Monday. I told you also that animal research that had shown, about the animal research that had shown that they altered levels of two kinds of neurotransmitters. Do you remember what they were? Serotonin and norepinephrine. What I didn't tell you on Monday was that over time, one long-standing concern about the tricyclic drugs was that they could pose for patients a cardiac risk, primarily because elevated levels of norepinephrine raise blood pressure, elevate heart rate. But for decades, it was thought that norepinephrine, not serotonin, was really the therapeutic, really needed to be the focus of therapeutic intervention. That was the important neurotransmitter. And so you just had to manage the risk. But then there was some research out in Scandinavia, actually associated with someone else I mentioned briefly last Monday, Arvid Carlson, suggesting that serotonin alone might actually lift mood. Maybe there was a potential to develop an effective antidepressant that targeted serotonin. And if you could, you might be able to an antidepressant where the risk of cardiac problems would be reduced. Eli Lilly, in this sort of context, takes a second look at a drug in their vault called fluoxetine. It works selectively on serotonin. They had thought maybe at one point they might market it as a weight loss drug, but that didn't go anywhere, and they decided instead to run some trials to see how it might do as an antidepressant. That would be less stressful on the heart. And there was no expectation that the drug would be a big moneymaker. I read reports in the Wall Street Journals in which they explicitly go to the trouble of warning their stockholders not to get their hopes up. But it's okay because their Elizabeth Arden line of cosmetics, which they had bought at that point, will sort of keep profits buoyed up. So everyone was going to be okay. They're going to come out with this. They bring it out in the market in 1987. Under the trade name Prozac. And you can see here, this is a 1993 ad, that they've adapted their marketing strategies to a new generation of clinicians who are now steeped in the world of the DSM. So Prozac is going to be a drug first line for all 9 symptoms of depression. These 9 symptoms are the symptoms in the DSM-3. Then came a big surprise. Within months, it was becoming clear that sales of Prozac were outpacing the sales of all the other antidepressants on the market. Not, I don't think, particularly because it was seen as the drug that hit all of the 9 symptoms of depression, but because it was seen as safer. than all the other antidepressants on the market. And so clinicians start prescribing it by preference, and not just by preference to patients to whom they might previously have prescribed a tricyclic antidepressant. They start prescribing it to patients who are less seriously ill, and therefore who a clinician might previously have hesitated to prescribe a tricyclic, thinking that the balance of risk versus clinical benefit might not make it worth it. And among these, a particularly significant group of less severely ill patients were patients with mixed symptoms of anxiety, despondency, depressed mood, patients who just a decade earlier might have been called a patient suffering from psychic tension, patients who might a decade earlier have been given a prescription of Valium. But doctors now weren't so inclined to prescribe Valium. Why? Because it had become more and more clear in the course of the 1970s, this is 1979, these are all late 1970s, reports that Valium, in fact, the benzodiazepines, in fact, could be highly addictive. So Valium's reputation as America's favorite chill pill begins to tank. Eli Lilly, meanwhile, is making a point of insisting that Prozac isn't habit-forming. Some clinical trials had also shown that Prozac didn't just lift mood, but also reduce symptoms of anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder. And so it just seemed that Prozac had arrived in time to meet a huge need in the market. Amplifying this development is another one. In 1993, a psychiatrist named Peter Kramer published what became a runaway bestseller called Listening to Prozac. And in it, he suggests that Prozac is different from other antidepressants in the market, not just because it's safer, that they thought, not just because it alleviates symptoms of low mood, but because it actually changes personalities. It helps people become more confident, more socially secure. It gives them wins that earlier generations thought you could only get through years of psychotherapy, if that, and you could get it from a pill. It seemed to give social confidence to the habitually timid, to make the sensitive brash, to lend the introvert the social skills of a salesman. And not only that, but the specific kind of personality that Prozac gifted you with seemed to be just right, just suited for the flourishing, surviving in the cutthroat corporate world of the late 80s and 90s. At one point, Kramer goes so far as to suggest that Prozac is a feminist drug, because it gives women a new edge, a new way to compete in a man's corporate world, liberating and empowering. And he admitted that he himself had given it to patients who no longer actually met the DSM criteria for major depression, because they'd asked for it. They liked being the kind of people that Prozac made them feel like. And as he put it in a sentence that would be repeated over and over again in all sorts of discussions, who was I to withhold from her the bounties of science? So Kramer's book gets a huge amount of attention, leads to a huge amount of new interest in Prozac, so much so that in France they ran an inquiry to see whether Kramer had actually been hired by Eli Lilly to write Listening to Prozac. He hadn't. But the effect of his writing on Eli Lilly's bottom line was as good as if it had been, because Prozac slowly becomes seen a little bit in the way that Valium had once been, not just as an antidepressant, but as a lifestyle drug. A personality facelift, a quick fix for what ailed, and it becomes the best-selling antidepressant in history. Now this is now the early 90s. And in the early 90s, patients are not necessarily thinking about this quick fix, this personality facelift that Prozac is, as a biological solution for their biological problems. But two things begin to change this. The first is copycat drugs start to appear. Zoloft, Paxil. Eli Lilly is not the only game on the block anymore. The second is that in 1997, the FDA relaxes regulations on the advertising of prescription drugs in ways that encourage these companies to begin to aggressively and competitively target their advertising not just to physicians anymore, but to consumers. And it's this development, the competitive pressure and the ability now to respond to that pressure by reaching out directly to consumers, that helps slowly to create a new biological culture of new popular culture of biological thinking about mental disorder. And let me show you a little bit about how this worked. This is the very first direct-to-consumer ad, I believe, ever in psychiatry. It's Eli Lilly's first ad for Prozac in 1997, just after the FDA relaxed its regulations. Can anyone, you can't see these things back there, can you? But you can see the picture, and you can read this: depression hurts, Prozac can help. Cloudy skies, rain, thunderstorms maybe even, and sunny sky. So transformation is implied in the imagery. The drug, a quick fix for what ails you. You can go from the storms to the sun. But the explanation about why you can do this now is in the story here. They say that first, it's a real illness. It's not just feeling down, it's a real illness. You can't will yourself out of it. Oops, hang on. And one thing that can happen, they say, when you're clinically depressed, is the level of serotonin, a chemical in your body, may drop. So you may have trouble sleeping, feel unusually sad or irritable, and so on. To help bring serotonin levels closer to normal, the medicine doctors now prescribe most often is Prozac. So what have they done? And then they go on to say a few other things. They say it isn't a happy pill, it's not a tranquilizer, don't worry about getting addicted. It won't take away your personality, depression can do that, but Prozac can't. Now you remember the animal research that I talked to you about last Monday from the 50s and 60s, showing that antidepressants seem to both reverse the lethargy, the kind of model depression that's experienced by certain laboratory animals, mice and rabbits, that had been artificially, that when animals were given a drug called Reframing, they both experience a kind of lethargy that looks a little bit like major depression, and they dump their stores of norepinephrine and serotonin, and the antidepressants seem to reverse that. And this had suggested a possible mechanism for the antidepressants. It didn't, however, prove that the animal model in which you give an animal a drug and they dump their serotonin stores proves that clinical patients with a clinical case of depression have naturally low levels of serotonin and norepinephrine. Everyone knew that. But advertising companies need a good story. And so they worked with what they had. In this ad, there's something very interesting that happens. They introduce all the serotonin stuff, and then they say, as you start feeling better, your doctor can suggest therapy or other means to help you work through your depression. This is 1997. So it's a slightly more nuanced, maybe more muddled message, because certainly by the time we get to the new millennium, 2000, 2001, it's become much simpler. The industry had converged on a consensus that a simple chemical imbalance story in which depression is due to a deficit of certain kinds of neurotransmitters and that the drugs replenish those neurotransmitters allowed it, I think, it seemed emerged for it as the best way to navigate between avoiding a reputation of just being a lifestyle drug, not Valium, on the one side, and yet still wanting to make the drug seem like an easy choice. So the images that you see here are from an ad campaign put together not for Prozac, but for one of its main rivals, Zoloft. Do any of you remember this ad campaign or these images? A few of you. The heart of the campaign was this adorable, sad blob that you see here under the rain cloud, whose problem is that he suffers from too little serotonin. And more than anyone else in the new millennium, this Zoloft blob becomes the cultural icon of a new kind of chemical imbalance vision of mental distress, particularly after he became a TV celebrity. I'll show you the first ad that features him.
You know when you feel the weight of sadness. You may feel exhausted, hopeless, and anxious. Whatever you do, you feel lonely and don't enjoy the things you once loved. Things just don't feel like they used to. These are some symptoms of depression, a serious medical condition affecting over 20 million Americans. While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of natural chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. Prescription Zoloft works to correct this imbalance. You just shouldn't have to feel this way anymore. Only your doctor can diagnose depression. Zoloft is not for everyone. People taking MAOIs or Pimozide shouldn't take Zoloft. Side effects may include dry mouth, insomnia, sexual side effects, diarrhea, nausea, and sleepiness. Zoloft is not habit-forming. Talk to your doctor about Zoloft, the #1 prescribed brand of its kind. Zoloft. When you know more about what's wrong, you can help make it right.
Any thoughts about this? Any things you noticed? Yeah. Good answer. Interesting answer. Yeah. Anything else? He's so adorable. There was even like a push for him to make like a plush version, like a stuffed animal version of him. He's adorable. Anything else? So one of the arguments that the industry made as to why the FDA should loosen its regulations was educational. That you put information in the hands of the people so they can make more informed consumer choices. That was part of the argument. But did you notice what the narrator actually said? While the cause of depression is unknown, comma, it may be. Now, I guess they had to do that. But all of the visuals don't suggest uncertainty, but suggest that we've got a cartoon showing that you've got too little and you're therefore depleted and you need more. Anything else you noticed? Yes. A lot of side effects, and yet while we're learning about the side effects, the little blue bird of happiness is popping along, getting ready to light on his shoulder. Excellent analysis, I think. But let me
You
now.
know when you-
Sorry. So here's the thing. Even as all of this really successful marketing was going on, behind the scenes, the drug companies, all of them, were frustrated by the continuing lack of scientific progress. That 50 or more years after the initial discovery of these antidepressants, drug researchers were still tinkering, and Prozac, the SSRIs I include within that, still tinkering with the same biochemical targets that have been the focus of work since the 1950s and 60s. And the companies needed radically new drugs because the clock was ticking on their existing products, and soon they would go off patent, and when that happened, look at what would happen to their bottom line. Here's what Zoloft cost when it was a brand name for a month's supply, $119. Here's what it would cost, $30, when it became generic. Prozac, $187, so it'd be $17 once it went generic. Yes?
So, having heard the claims all my life that FDA approves things that are safe and effective,
Yes.
the claim that something may be effective seems a little bit weak for an advertisement for a drug
With many side effects.
with many side effects. Is there, so then there's on the whole, so random assignment, double-blind clinical studies, I assume they were conducted.
They were conducted.
And so why then the weak claim? And then also a separate question would be, more recent or statistically savvy people can identify that pharmaceutical companies don't report the clinical studies which don't support the
Did everyone hear the question?
So is this a retrospective? I mean,
In the 1990s, a guy named Irving Kirsch goes back and reviews the published literature, and later will also get permission to, through the Freedom of Information Act, to review some of the unpublished trials, and concluded that something like, I can't remember the exact number, something like 75 initially, he said 75% of the efficacy of the SSRIs was the placebo effect. And later, when he gets the Freedom of Information Act to give him access to the unpublished trials, the figure goes up to 83%. And he publishes his initial expose in a piece called Listening to Prozac and Hearing Placebo. It was Irving Kirsch. He's a clinical psychologist who I know a bit. Listening to Prozac and hearing placebo. And I remember the furore, because clinicians who work with patients saw, like Peter Kramer, I'm seeing miracles with these drugs. I'm seeing amazing results. But the clinical trials didn't really sort of support that, at least not consistently. And I think what most people might will conclude is that they work for some people and they don't work for other people, and you don't know why. Well, because they only need to know about aggregate results. They don't need to, not every patient has to get well for it to pass. I think it's a great, now I'm not an expert on the history of the FDA. I know there are people like Edward Shorter, who is an historian of psychiatry, who has written about, he thinks the FDA is the big boogeyman in this whole story. So you might want to go look his stuff up. Yes?
it's a very strange position for me to be here defending orthodoxy. It's really unusual. But there's a whole literature in and of itself on evaluating randomized controlled double-blind trials with drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And the Kirsch savaged the early findings and got a very willing audience. But there's been a lot of progress in defining the techniques of evaluation of pharmacology and so on. And the way the wind's blowing now in terms of the way people analyze the latest studies, study trials and other things, is that there's a complete response in about 40% of people. There's a partial response, and about 30% of people complete response to antidepressants. There's about a 15 to 20% partial response. About 50%
Don't respond at all.
don't respond at all on the first trial of an antidepressant. And then there are strategies about what percentage of response you get when you switch, when you augment, and so on. So Kirsch was too bleak. But there's still certainly an insufficient number of people who do respond to the medication. There's no doubt about that.
And I'm not denying that either. But from a point of view of the drug industry, which is, I want to just pivot us back to my where I want to go with my story. They had these drugs out in the market. They're now worried about not having new ones. They need something new.
Actually, the other point I wanted to make is that there's been some recent disambiguation of some of these findings, in that if you disaggregate patients into the more severe versus the moderate depression, the more severe depression show a higher response.
I know Kirsch talks about that, and the suggestion might be not that the drugs work, this is what he says. It might not be that the drugs work better on them, but they have less of a placebo response because they're more hopeless. Just a thought.
I think that's true. They're burned out on placebo.
Let me just tell you a little bit more, because we're already deep in the discussion and it's really fun, but I want to just make a few more points. First about because we're trying to understand the role that the pharmaceutical industry played in this larger story. And the irony is that, in fact, they were working with very slim pickings, even as they promoted, in terms of innovative new developments, even as they promoted as much as they could the drugs that they had out on the market. They were worried about the drugs going off patent. And their strategy, what are we going to do to keep our stockholders happy? Well, maybe we can identify new disorders in the DSM, which added more and more diagnostic categories with every new addition that had not yet been claimed by any particular pharmacological intervention and could persuade the FDA that their antidepressants were effective for one or another of them. And this is a complicated story that I don't have time to go into, but it explains why the same adorable Zoloft blob that in 2001 suffered from depression shows up at a party in 2004, suffering from a then little-known DSM diagnostic category called social anxiety disorder. In the TV ad for this, you hear the very same announcer, they used exactly the same guy, who was suggesting that the drug Zoloft that he'd been recommending as a targeted antidepressant for depression, as a targeted treatment for depression, could now help with this apparently very different kind of distress. And this bought Pfizer time. And all of the companies in a range of ways did this. People might talk about this sometimes as disease mongering, having a drug and then looking for new disorders in which it might be effective. Now, of course, it had been found in early trials that is the reason why it was given to patients that previously might have been given Valium, that these drugs were helpful with anxiety in many instances. But when they went to the FDA, it was not that wasn't the way they talked about it. They talked about it as a targeted drug for depression, and then they talked about it as a targeted drug now. They went for social anxiety disorder. Paxil went for other kinds of disorder, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and so on. Well, so what about everybody else? We've talked about research, about drug development, about patients and popular culture. What about the clinicians, the rank and file ordinary people? How did they adjust to the new biological regime? And the evidence suggests that pretty much all of them, they got in line. There's a book by an anthropologist called Of Two Minds about she went, but her name is, come on, what is the name of this anthropologist who went to McLean just in this period when the field was pivoting, and followed residents, medical residents, psychiatric residents through their training as they were introducing the new biological orthodoxies. Yes, thank you, Tanya Lerman. Thank you for this. Exactly, Tanya Lerman. So they're all being taught now to rally around the new orthodoxy, but it does seem that beneath the surface, when you read them, speaking more to each other than to the general public, that there's considerable confusion about what it means to be medical. In the end, it comes to mostly mean we prescribe the drugs. And all the more so because now the clinical psychologists, the social workers, the counselors, even the psychiatric nurses are doing more and more of the psychotherapy that previously psychiatrists had done. And as pressures grow generally to rein in healthcare costs, the unique right to prescribe drugs becomes almost existential for psychiatry. It's the red line that psychiatrists insist separate them as a medical profession from all these other lower status mental health professionals who might have been cheaper to reimburse. Here you can see Eve Fuller-Turry saying, if psychologists start prescribing medication, then what is a psychiatrist? It's not clear. And then, having made drugs so central to their professional identity, many psychiatrists in the 1990s and beyond go one step further in ways that are well known. They follow the drug money. They accept various roles within the pharmaceutical industry, fees to give educational talks about the virtues of specific products. They call them key opinion leaders, but it's clear when you listen to the drug company's representatives that, from their point of view, they're salespeople. If they give a talk and the sales don't go up, these guys would not be invited back again. To give a sense of just how many took on this kind of work, in 2008, the American Psychiatric Association introduced new disclosure requirements to any speakers who wanted to speak at the conference. And in that year, out of 273 speakers who disclosed their involvement with the industry, reports revealed that between them they had signed 888 consulting contracts and 483 contracts of other sorts with the industry. Now, Since then, to a certain extent, I think the field has grown a bit of a conscience. There's been a fair amount of shaming and whistleblowing. And some of the one-time common practices around, in terms of building, offering your for-fee expertise to the industry have become much more taboo. But even if that hadn't happened, I want to suggest it's unlikely that the compromised relationships that used to exist between Big Pharma and psychiatry would have persisted into our own day, in quite the same way at least. And the reason is that it's no longer worth the industry's time. It's no longer worth the industry's time to pay the fat fees because there are so few new drugs in the pipelines, and all the old drugs are now finally off patent. And in fact, beginning around 2010, far from continuing to throw big amounts of money at the field, most of the big companies began to abandon research in psychopharmaceuticals. They just couldn't figure out any way to make big money in this area anymore. This was partly because they lacked good ideas about where to look for new biomarkers, and partly because we sort of hinted at in the earlier discussion, because it was more and more difficult to get even products that were variants on existing templates through clinical trials. And the reason is that in order to get through a clinical trial, a drug has to outperform the placebo. And by 2008 or so, companies were finding it was harder and harder to do this. The placebo effect had always been a significant nuisance factor in clinical trials, but by 2008, it was becoming almost an intractable factor, particularly in the area of anxiety, depression, and pain. And no one quite really understood why. The upshot is that today, when you go onto the websites of the big pharmaceutical companies that used to make their big money from psychopharmaceuticals, they've turned their attention elsewhere. These are all the companies that used to be big. And look what they're focused on now: oncology, diabetes, infectious disease, vaccines. Alzheimer's is a kind of a quasi-exception here, because if you could have an Alzheimer's drug that showed any promise, it would be huge money. But look, Pfizer, internal medicine, inflammation, oncology, rare disease, vaccines, anti-infectives. I went onto the NIH website to try to find clinical trials for new pharmaceuticals. I couldn't find things. People are betting on other horses. The only exception, notable, fraught exception, which I was sure that somebody would raise, so I figured I better get ahead of the curve, is this new interest in repurposing older psychedelic drugs, all with histories as street drugs and party drugs, like ketamine, even LSD and other psychedelics, and repurposing them as medications for anxiety and depression. This is a very unfinished story. Maybe the 2020s will be the decade of psychedelic breakthroughs, and I don't know what's going to happen, of course. But I have to say that I fear the haste with which this story is unfolding. I fear how much it seems to be driven by renewed hopes of big profits and the kind of rush to get on a bandwagon because finally there's something new to conjure with. I am following this story, and I'm worried about this story. But the alacrity with which people are jumping on tells us something about the sense of a desert in which they had been in for so long. Meanwhile, Psychiatry's diagnostic manual that I talked about last week, the so-called DSM, that was supposed to be the foundational text for the new medically minded psychiatry, has fallen into a state of malaise. It's under attack not just by critical outsiders, because people have been doing that forever, but by informed insiders, like, again, former NIMH Director Tom Insel, who says that the DSM not only has failed to deliver on its promise to serve as a foundation for the new biological psychiatry, it's impeded that biological revolution. As he put it, he's actually talking about the DSM-5, which comes out in 2013. Biology never read that book. It's an incredible statement to make. I was actually at the APA in 2013 giving another talk when the DSM-5 was released. It was supposed to be a big celebration. Everyone was so depressed and so confused. It really was striking. I don't know if, were any of you there? Any of you remember? You were. Do you? And people sort of milling around looking at the piles of books and not quite sure, because Tom Insel had come out with a statement saying the NIMH is going to not use DSM categories for its further research. Instead, what they would do is develop its own system, the so-called RDoC, Research Domains Criteria System, that instead of starting with high-level diagnostic categories and then trying to find the biomarkers or the lower-level causes of the disorders, you would start with very low-level categories of functional analysis derived from molecular biology or cognitive science and work your way up. You map the ocean floor, as he put it. And for several years, the NIMH was all gung-ho about RDoC. But then something happened that seems to have really gotten to Tom Insel. And he tells this story about how he was giving this talk saying about all the wonderful things that the NIMH was doing, and this is what a man in the audience said: "You don't get it. Our house is on fire, and you're telling us about the chemistry of the paint. We need someone to focus on the fire." And maybe because of that, or maybe in addition, there were for other reasons, but what Tom Insel does, to me, seems almost emblematic of the moment that we're in terms of the biological revolution in psychiatry. Having invested, on behalf of the NIMH, billions of dollars in the project, he jumps ship. He leaves the NIMH, he goes to work for Google, for its research arm Alphabet, and today he is president of his own company called MindStrong that is attempting to use the power of smartphones to identify people at risk in terms of the changes in their behavior in the ways they interact with their phones. It's a kind of surveillance technology. And that's where he hopes the future of helping, that's how he hopes to put out the fire. Others, of course, continue to work with great energy in the biological trenches. I'm showing you a picture of a friend of mine, Stephen Hyman, at Harvard. I've talked to Stephen a lot about where he thinks the field is at. He read an early draft of Mind Pictures of the book. He's very straight talker. He's very honest. He's a very good scientist, and he says it could be 40 years before anything useful comes out of the kind of work that his lab and institute is doing. And he's saying this, just to be clear, a full 40 years after the 1980s biological revolutionaries declared victory. And this is a long time for a revolution to make good on its promises. And I think most people probably feel we can't just stay on cruise control for another 40 years. And it seems to me instead that we're at an inflection point, that the 1980s optimistic biological psychiatry that everyone was so excited about has run into the sands, that the field needs a reset. So what should happen next? So I don't know, but no, I don't, but I do hope, I'll say a few things, that whatever people do, they resist declaring another revolution, because history suggests that these kinds of things don't serve either the profession or patients. I hope instead that we can slow down, that we can take stock, that we can ask questions about ways that trashing everything that your rivals stood for makes everyone more ignorant, not smarter. I hope we can find ways to lean in rather than retreat from phenomena like the placebo effect, for example. That's frustrated. That's the reason why, part of the reason why the industry has fled psychiatry, and ask instead what phenomena like the placebo effect have to teach us about ways in which human brains don't just respond to pharmaceuticals, but respond to set and setting and context and relationships, that the ways in which the human brain is a social brain. So the idea that there is psychotherapy, which is about the mind, and drugs, which is about the brain, in a sense, collapse. I hope also that psychiatry, looking ahead, can find ways to become less defensive about its medical identity, less hierarchical, acknowledge the need for all sorts of expertise, including forms of expertise that are not about biology, to come together to serve patients. If it turns out that answers or interventions like safe housing or actually help people with chronic mental illness more than yet another prescription, then that's what should be done. Whatever I think happens, I hope that I've been able to persuade you at least somewhat that history matters, that knowing how we really got here, and therefore why we are in the kind of situation that we are, helps to maybe frame and jumpstart some kinds of hopefully constructive conversations, therefore, about where we need to go to move things to a better place. Thank you very much.